Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. Today we're going to talk about 5 things you're probably doing wrong in Unreal Engine. To start off, we're going to actually talk about widgets and sort of, a lot of people don't create widget classes. Instead, they tend to use the default widgets that are included with Unreal Engine. Now, the problem with that is it leads to the fact that there's no consistency. You'll have, 10 buttons, none of which are the exact same. Now, of course, you can copy paste properties, but to make your life easier, especially if you got a game that's got a lot of UI or a lot of different buttons, you can make your life a lot easier by doing something like this, where I have these buttons. Now, these are using common UI, so I am using a style guide here, but also they are their own separate widget. I've got some settings here. If I go ahead and hit edit, it opens up a blueprint and I can make changes, and that affects all of the buttons. Now, of course, if you don't want to affect all the buttons, you have a couple of variants of those buttons. But by default, when you're editing a button, you usually want it to affect most, if not all, especially from a functionality standpoint. You want it to do things when you hover it and things like that. And so something a lot of people forget to do is actually create base classes based off of those built-in types of widgets. You got things like sliders and items like that, and while they are useful, if you don't build your own class around them, they end up being very inflexible. You end up having to do a lot of the same things over and over and over for each version of that slider that you ever put in, versus you put in a little bit of logic with it. It's relatively straightforward and simple to deal with. So that's number one. Number two we're going to be talking about is actually not packaging often enough. So we go here and open up our packaging settings here. There's a lot of different options here, and it can definitely get overwhelming. But I think something not enough people do, when you're looking at your project launcher and your packaging settings, they don't launch or package the game in a standalone version often enough. A lot of people will go ahead and just sort of do it at the end, hoping that it works. And what ends up happening is they run into a lot of issues, and these issues take time to fix. And if you're looking for a fix, it's not always easy to go find those fixes. And so by leaving it towards the end, you're only leaving yourself more headache. So what I usually tell people is, you want to try and package, relatively frequently. If you've made a big overhaul, added some big new feature, maybe go ahead and throw a package on overnight. It only takes 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how you have your thing set up. You have to do a full rebuild, of course, it's going to take longer. But if you allow it to reuse a lot of the cooked assets from before, if they haven't made any changes, it's usually a lot faster to package your game. And then just go ahead and playtest it. Just make sure things work as expected. That's where you find errors with mixing textures because you forgot to include something in a hard reference. Instead, they're all soft references. Or you'll find that maybe a asset you thought was getting loaded just isn't being loaded at the correct time. There's just lots of different things you can catch if you make sure you're packaging and testing relatively frequently. Up next, we're actually talking about something a little interesting called casting. And I think that this is one of the most hotly debated topics for blueprint designers, I would say. And that's just, do you cast all the time? Do you not cast almost ever? People go back and forth. I think the answer is somewhere in between. The reason why so many people try to avoid casting is because casting itself loads whatever you're casting to into memory, depending on how you're casting to it, right? So a lot of people, they hear that it's something wrong with performance, so they're like, oh, I should always avoid these at all time. But that's actually not the case. The big thing you want to do is you want to kind of think about it like this. Can I cast this more generically? If so, great, do that. For example, with widgets, if you don't need to cast to the base widget, you can just cast to, widget actors in general. That's great because then you're not calling to that direct reference. You're not creating a hard reference. But if you are, let's say you need to run a function off of that specific widget, well, if you know that widget's already active, it's already loaded into memory, there's no performance hit. You're not losing anything by casting to it. The only time the casting becomes a problem is when you want things to be loaded in memory only at specific times. For example, let's say you have a variety of different AI blueprints that are just a bunch of different types of enemies, and you don't know for sure that certain ones are going to be loaded. If you start loading them all into memory, then it can get a bit bloated, and you'll have a whole bunch of extra memory being loaded that you maybe don't need, and it could be a little faster. And so you can use something like an interface that all of your AIs just have to implement. And in that example, it's very easy to just do a raycast. Let's say as the example, you're raycasting to that specific enemy, and instead of casting to a specific enemy you're looking for, you just have only that one specific enemy implement that interface. Whether it's a specific function in that interface, they're the ones implementing it, or you just have them only implement that interface. It's up to you as far as design wise. But the goal with casting is if it's already going to be loaded into memory, or should mostly be loaded into memory, it's not a huge deal. But if it's something that will almost never be loaded in memory or rarely loaded in memory, and maybe it's something that you don't want loaded all the time in memory, something maybe it's a little heavier, you want to try and use maybe interfaces for, or you can even use event dispatchers. But casting is not some boogeyman that's going to destroy your game's performance simply by the nature of using it. A lot of newbies, in the tutorials are taught only to ever use casting, and of course that's the wrong way because there are times when you don't want to use casting. But then you got intermediates who kind of go the opposite direction that are always like, oh, never cast, but that's also not correct. The real answer is, you have to make that call as a programmer. You need to decide when to cast and when not to cast. But yeah, so that's sort of casting as a whole. Next, we're going to be talking about version control. Way too often, I'll see posts in Unreal Engine, I'll see it in Discord, people just saying, I've lost everything, how do I get this back? The truth of the matter is, most of the time you're not going to get that back. Most of the time that stuff's just gone. If you're lucky, maybe you've got some recovery tools, you can get some of the stuff back. But if you have no version control, you lose everything most of the time. Especially if your computer dies or anything bad happens to it, all that progress is gone. Now, if it's just something you're fiddling around with, something you're learning with, it's not a huge deal. But everybody who's wanting to make a game, if you're working in Unreal Engine with the goal of making a game, you need to have version control. Even if it's as simple as, a GitHub repo that you just do a mass dump to maybe every day. When you're done working, you just go to GitHub, you push a commit. I still think you should be pushing commits more often than that, because then you end up with losing hours of work if something does happen. But at least that is some level of protection. There's people out there that are just raw dogging it with no repos at all, with no version control at all, and that is just a very quick way to lose all of your progress. But yeah, and our last thing we're going to talk about here is actually tooling. So when we're talking about tooling, right, we're talking about editor utilities. Now, something not enough tutorials cover, and is not something that enough people are aware of, is that editor utilities are actually a super handy way to do things in the engine and make your life just that little bit easier. In fact, a lot of us like to joke is that about 50% of programming is just making yourself tools. And so what I'm going to look at here, show you here, is just, I've got a couple here, nothing crazy, just 3 little simple tools. We're talking about creating. Basically what these do is, one of them sets my Discord activity for the game, and I do that specifically just because I wanted to test out the Discord utility and see what activities I could do with it. Then these other 2 are FPS testers. One sets the FPS to limited, the other one sets it to 60 frames per second. I was using those as a way to, without having to type in, a line of code, I could just hit those and boom, it would, set them to the correct numbers that I wanted. Now, of course, there's a lot you can do with editor utilities. They're very flexible. You can use them to, edit entire actors across an entire level. You can use them to add or remove instances of things. There's a whole bunch of different things you can do with them. And just they're a very underestimated tool in your tool bag. And so don't be afraid to go in and dive in and learn about, what editor utilities can do. And to really sit down and figure out, okay, how can I make tooling for myself to make my life easier? For example, this setting the Discord status, I created that because I wanted a way to actually manually watch the Discord status change and just see how it hit my code, so I could walk through the breakthroughs, just kind of see what was going on and how that actually functioned. And so because of that, it was just as simple as creating a button that would call the code that I already had created. And instead of having to load the game, walk through the steps, and see it in game, I can just click one button in the editor and have it load. Um, but yeah, so that was the 5 things that I think a lot of people get wrong when they're working in Unreal Engine. Some of that's for beginners, some of that's for advanced. But if you have any questions or anything else you'd like to know more about, definitely leave a comment down below. But otherwise, good luck and good hunting.